My name is Savannah. I'm in my mid 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in rooms where decisions were made quietly, usually without me in them. I've been described as dependable, composed, and easy to work with. People often mistake that last one for harmless. I've learned that when you don't raise your voice, when you don't demand the spotlight, others start to edit you down in their minds. They assume you're fine with less credit, less protection, and less truth. They assume that if something goes wrong, you won't push back. You'll absorb it. You'll keep things smooth. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic way. It's about what happens when quiet competence collides with quiet accusation, and how clarity, not anger, can shift the balance of power. If you're here because of the title, you already know the shape of the accusation. My boss filed a police report claiming I stole company IP. That sentence alone can hollow out a person. It carries weight, fear, and a kind of public stain that doesn't wait for facts. But this story isn't a courtroom thriller or a takedown montage. It's a slow walk through how trust erodes, how invisibility becomes dangerous, and how truth doesn't always arrive loudly. What you'll hear over the next hour is a first person account of how I was underestimated, how small dismissals stacked into something structural, and how a single piece of evidence, quiet, objective, and undeniable, changed everything without shouting. There were no dramatic confrontations in the hallways, no viral moments, no speeches, just patience, documentation, and timing. I'm telling this now because stories like this are usually told from the other side, by people with titles, lawyers, or platforms. Mine unfolded in meeting rooms, shared drives, and security logs. It unfolded while I kept doing my job, while people assumed I didn't notice what was happening. I want to be clear about one thing from the start. I didn't win because I was smarter than everyone else. I didn't win because I was angrier. I won because I paid attention, because I understood my own moral line, and because I waited until the truth could stand on its own without me defending it. If you've ever been the person others lean on but don't really see, if you've ever felt your silence interpreted as consent, this story might feel familiar, not because of the outcome, but because of the process. So as you listen, I invite you to listen slowly. Notice the small moments, the pauses, the things that don't seem important until they are. And before we go any further, I want to ask you something gently, without pressure. Have you ever realized too late that someone had already decided who you were long before you had the chance to speak for yourself? To them, I was dependable background noise. That's not bitterness talking. It's just the most accurate description I have. I was the person whose calendar was always open, whose notes were always thorough, whose follow-ups arrived before anyone had to ask. If something broke quietly, I fixed it. If something went wrong subtly, I absorbed it before it reached anyone important. In meetings, I sat slightly off-center, not hidden, just not positioned to interrupt the flow. When I spoke, people nodded. Sometimes they wrote things down. Often, someone else repeated my point 10 minutes later and received the credit. And I told myself that was fine. I wasn't there to be impressive. I was there to be useful. That was the role I played well. My boss liked to describe me as solid. Not brilliant, not visionary. Solid, the kind of word you use when you want reliability without challenge. When executives toured the department, he'd gesture vaguely in my direction and say, "Savannah keeps things running," as if I were part of the infrastructure, like wiring or plumbing. And I accepted that framing longer than I should have because it came with a certain safety. People don't scrutinize what they take for granted. They don't question the intentions of someone who never raises their voice or takes up too much space. Invisibility can feel like protection until it isn't. I didn't dress to stand out. I didn't argue in meetings. I didn't correct people publicly, even when I knew they were wrong. I learned early in my career that being labeled difficult sticks longer than being right. So I chose precision over performance, documentation over debate. What most of them never noticed was how closely I was paying attention. I noticed patterns. Who forwarded emails and who didn't. Who asked for verbal updates but avoided written confirmation. Who accessed shared folders late at night. Who framed decisions as collective when they were anything but. But to them, I was predictable, safe, someone who would never cause trouble. That perception shaped everything that followed. When new hires joined, they were told to come to me. If you need help understanding how things really work, I became a translator, a buffer, a soft landing. And with each small act of support, my identity flattened further. I was no longer seen as someone with stakes, just someone with capacity. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with that. Not dramatic loneliness, functional loneliness. You're surrounded by people who rely on you but don't imagine you as a variable in the equation. You're assumed to be constant. And constants, in people's minds, don't change. They don't push back. They don't surprise you. I told myself I was fine with that. I told myself that quiet work mattered more than recognition, that integrity didn't need witnesses. But here's the truth I didn't admit out loud back then. When you are seen as invisible long enough, people start to believe you're also incapable of defending yourself. They forget that you have memory, that you have records, that you have a line. I had one, I just hadn't tested it yet. At that point in the story, there was no accusation, no police report, no sense of danger. Just a gradual narrowing of how I was perceived, a quiet rewriting of my role until it excluded authority, voice, and eventually trust. If you had asked anyone in the office who Savannah was, they would have said, "She's great, she handles things. You don't have to worry about her." And that sentence, more than anything else, explains why what happened next was even possible. Because when people don't worry about you, they don't imagine you pushing back. They don't imagine you holding evidence. They don't imagine you being the person the truth eventually stands with. They imagine you staying where they left you. The first moment that stayed with me didn't feel important at the time. That's how these things usually begin. Not with impact, but with plausibility. It happened during a routine review meeting. Quarterly, predictable, almost scripted. I had prepared a summary of workflow optimizations I'd implemented quietly over the previous months. Nothing flashy, just reduced redundancies, cleaner handoffs, fewer late-night emergencies, the kind of work that doesn't look impressive unless you remember what things were like before. My boss skimmed the document, nodded, and said, "Good, we'll integrate this." That word slipped by easily. No credit given, no attribution removed, just absorbed. I told myself that was normal. Team language, leadership language. Then 10 minutes later, he pulled up a slide deck I hadn't seen before. My framework was there. Same structure, same logic, slightly different wording. He walked through the room as if it had emerged fully formed during his morning coffee. People reacted the way people do. Compliments, questions, interest. He answered smoothly, confidently. No one looked at me. I felt something then, a brief tightening in my chest, but I ignored it. I told myself I didn't need acknowledgement to know my work mattered, that I wasn't in this for applause. That was the rationalization. The truth was simpler. Correcting him would have made things awkward, and I had spent years perfecting the art of not being awkward. After the meeting, one of my colleagues leaned over and said, "Nice system. That's clever." Not your system, just clever, floating, ownerless. I smiled and said thank you. That was the first small cut. Not because of the credit, but because of what it signaled. My contributions were becoming detachable from me, useful without being traceable. After that, things shifted subtly. Requests started coming verbally instead of by email. "Can you just pull this together? Can you take a quick look at this?" No paper trail, no timestamps. I didn't think much of it at first, until I realized who wasn't being asked the same way. When I sent follow-up emails summarizing decisions, they went unanswered. Not rejected, just left there, hanging. As if documentation itself had become inconvenient. Once, during a project debrief, I referenced a decision that had been made weeks earlier. My boss frowned and said, "I don't remember agreeing to that." I did. I had the notes, the calendar invite, the action items. But I hesitated. I felt the room's temperature change. Not sharply, just enough to warn me. Challenging him publicly would make me that person. The one who nitpicks. The one who needs to be right. So I softened it. "Maybe I misunderstood," I said. "I'll double check." That was the second cut. Smaller, but deeper. Because this time I helped rewrite reality against myself. After that, I started noticing how often my memory was treated as flexible when it conflicted with his. How often certainty flowed in one direction. No one else seemed bothered, or maybe they were, but not enough to say anything. It's easier to let these moments slide when they don't land on you directly. I remember walking back to my desk that day and opening my notebook, the one I'd carried for years, more out of habit than intention. I wrote down what had happened, just a sentence. Date, context, words used. I didn't know why I did it. I wasn't planning anything. It felt almost silly, paranoid even. But something in me had registered a shift, not in behavior, but in alignment. A sense that the version of events being spoken aloud no longer reliably matched the one I was living. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself it was a misunderstanding, that stress made people forgetful, that my job was to support, not to correct. But once you notice the first cut, you start to feel the others, even when they don't break the skin. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a question began to form, soft, unfinished, easy to ignore. If this keeps happening, who do they think I am? After the first few moments like that, it would have been easier if things had escalated quickly. A clear conflict, a single unmistakable line crossed. But instead, the disrespect settled in gradually, like a low-level hum you stop noticing because it never quite goes away. What changed wasn't the behavior itself, it was the frequency. Ideas I shared in one-on-one conversations reappeared later as collective conclusions. Decisions I remembered clearly became open questions. Tasks I completed were assumed to be ongoing, as if my work existed in a permanent state of almost done. Each incident, taken alone, was explainable. Forgetfulness, busyness, miscommunication. I became very good at explaining these things to myself. I told myself I was being mature, professional, that I didn't need to defend every detail to know my value. But the cost of that posture is subtle. You don't feel it immediately. It accumulates. I noticed how often my boss would summarize meetings without mentioning my contributions, even when they were central. How he'd say things like, "We've been thinking about," when I knew exactly who had done the thinking. How often my name disappeared from email threads right before decisions were finalized. When I was included, it was usually at the beginning, during setup, planning, groundwork. When outcomes were discussed, I was less essential. It would have been one thing if this were happening to everyone, but it wasn't. Others were quoted, referenced, positioned. I started to understand something uncomfortable. I wasn't being overlooked, I was being used, and then quietly removed from the narrative. Still, I stayed quiet. Part of that was conditioning. I'd been taught, explicitly and implicitly, that pushing back too often makes you expendable, that you earn security by being agreeable, by not complicating things. Another part was fear. Not dramatic fear, but the practical kind. Rent, stability, reputation. I had seen what happened to people who challenged authority without airtight protection. They weren't fired outright. They were sidelined, reassigned, slowly erased. So I adapted. I softened my language further. I asked more questions instead of making statements. I framed certainty as a suggestion. I used phrases like, "just a flag," and "might be worth considering." I shrank my presence to fit the space that was being offered, and for a while that worked. Things stayed calm, predictable. But calm isn't the same as safe. One afternoon, while reviewing access logs for a system update, I noticed something odd. A file that had been checked out, then returned, then checked out again. Same user, same external drive identifier. It wasn't a violation, not yet, just unusual. I flagged it mentally and moved on. That was around the time my boss began delegating sensitive tasks without context. "Just handle it," he'd say. "You know what to do." I did, but I also noticed he was no longer putting his own name on certain approvals. Things that used to require his sign-off were now routed through me. At first, I took it as trust. Later, I realized trust leaves a trail. This didn't. I began keeping more detailed notes, not because I expected anything to happen, but because the pattern of dismissal had trained me to rely on my own records. I stopped assuming shared memory was reliable. What surprised me most was how normal all of this felt after a while. That's the danger. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives wearing familiarity. You adjust to it, you accommodate it, you begin to believe that this is just how things work. I remember sitting at my desk one evening, long after most people had left, reviewing a chain of emails that no longer included me. Decisions had been made, outcomes set. My work is embedded throughout, invisible. I didn't feel angry. I felt small, replaceable, and that feeling scared me more than anger would have. Because when you start believing you're replaceable, you stop defending the things that make you distinct. You start protecting the role instead of the self. That's where I was when the next shift happened. Not the one that changed everything, but the one that made it possible. I normalized the disrespect so thoroughly that when something truly wrong occurred, it didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as an extension. And that's the most dangerous moment of all, when harm feels like a continuation of the ordinary, rather than a break from it. There comes a point when you stop asking why something is happening and start understanding what role you're being asked to play. For me, that realization didn't come during a confrontation or a crisis. It came during a planning session that wasn't really a planning session at all, more like a performance review disguised as alignment. My boss was outlining future direction, using that calm, authoritative tone that signals decisions have already been made. As he spoke, I noticed how often he referenced my reliability, my consistency, my willingness to step in. "You're someone we can count on," he said, looking at me with what I now recognize as strategic warmth. "You don't need a lot of oversight." It sounded like praise. It even felt like praise for a moment. But then he added, "Which is why I think it makes sense for you to continue handling the back-end pieces. You're not really the face of these initiatives, but you make them possible." That was the role, stated clearly, cleanly, without malice. Reliable, useful, invisible. I nodded, because nodding was what I did. Because pushing back would have required explaining something I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet, that I had allowed my own boundaries to erode in exchange for stability. From that point on, the pattern sharpened. I was looped in early and removed late, asked to prepare and not to present, trusted with access but not with authority. My name became associated with execution, not decision-making. And when mistakes happened, inevitable, minor, systemic mistakes, they landed closer to me than anyone else. Not overt blame, just proximity. "Well, Savannah was handling that piece," someone would say. Not accusing, just orienting the room. I started to understand the unspoken agreement. I would absorb complexity so others could remain clean. I would hold the details so others could speak in summaries. That role works until it doesn't. Because when you are positioned as infrastructure, accountability flows toward you when something breaks, even if you didn't cause the damage. I saw it happen in small ways first. A missed deadline was blamed on a dependency I didn't control. A miscommunication was framed as my misunderstanding. Each time, I corrected quietly, privately, without escalating. And each time, the role solidified further. I wasn't being targeted yet, I was being positioned. That distinction matters. People imagine betrayal as sudden, as emotional, as personal. But most of the time it's logistical, it's about convenience, about where blame can land with the least resistance. I was low resistance. I didn't complain. I didn't document publicly. I didn't demand visibility. I didn't threaten anyone's narrative. So when processes shifted, when oversight thinned, when lines of responsibility blurred, I was the natural place for ambiguity to settle. Still, I stayed. I told myself that competence would protect me, that integrity had its own gravity, that if I just kept doing good work, things would correct themselves. But systems don't self-correct when they benefit from imbalance. One evening, while reviewing permissions for an upcoming audit, I noticed that my access level had quietly expanded. Not dramatically, just enough to include areas I'd never requested. I asked about it. My boss waved it off. "It's easier if you just have access. Saves time." Again, it sounded like trust. But trust doesn't usually arrive unannounced. It's discussed, defined. This wasn't that. I began to see the role clearly now. Not just how others saw me, but how they needed me to be seen. Capable enough to carry weight, quiet enough not to resist it. That was when I stopped assuming goodwill was enough. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't withdraw. But internally, something shifted. I stopped thinking of my role as fixed. I started thinking of it as temporary. And that single reframing, small, private, almost invisible, was the beginning of everything that followed. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no moment you'd circle on a calendar and label before and after. It was quiet, ordinary, almost forgettable, except for how clearly I remember the light in the room. It was late afternoon, that slow hour when the office settles into a kind of artificial calm. People are still working, but the urgency has thinned. Conversations are softer. Decisions feel postponed. I was alone in a small conference room, reviewing files for a routine compliance check. The door was open. The hallway was empty. As I scrolled, I noticed a folder I hadn't seen before. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't mislabeled. It was just there. Accessible under my credentials, timestamped recently. Inside were versions of documents I recognized immediately. Internal frameworks, process maps, drafts of material that hadn't been approved for external use. My first reaction wasn't an alarm, it was confusion. I checked the metadata. Creation dates didn't match the version history I remembered. Author fields were inconsistent. Some files had been copied, not edited. Again, none of this was proof of wrongdoing, but it was enough to interrupt my autopilot. I didn't open everything, I didn't download anything, I didn't even take screenshots. I closed the folder. Then I sat there, hands folded, listening to the quiet hum of the building, and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Clarity without emotion. Not anger, not fear, just a clean understanding that whatever was happening around me was no longer neutral. Up until that point, I had been adapting, adjusting, rationalizing, but this was different. This was a sign that boundaries, technical, procedural, ethical, were being treated as flexible by someone who assumed flexibility wouldn't be questioned. And I realized something important in that moment. If this ever turned into a problem, the story would not default in my favor. I was the one with access, the one who handled things, the one who didn't need oversight. I was the perfect container. I closed my laptop and walked back to my desk. Not with urgency, but with intention. I pulled out my notebook and wrote a single line. Stop assuming fairness is automatic. That was the shift, not toward confrontation, toward observation. From that day on, I changed how I moved, not visibly, but precisely. I stopped answering questions verbally when documentation was appropriate. I followed up every conversation with neutral summaries, not defensive, just factual. I reviewed access logs more carefully, not obsessively, methodically. I learned the difference between what I was responsible for and what I merely had access to. And I began to mark that distinction clearly in my own records. I didn't accuse, I didn't warn, I didn't signal distrust. I just stopped being naive. What surprised me was how easy it was to do this without anyone noticing. Because to them, nothing had changed. I was still calm, still agreeable, still efficient. But internally, I was no longer trying to be liked. I was trying to be accurate. There's a difference. Accuracy doesn't rush, it doesn't dramatize, it waits until patterns are undeniable. In the days that followed, I noticed how often my boss worked late, how often were certain files accessed after hours, how external devices appeared briefly in the system and then disappeared. I didn't jump to conclusions, I didn't create narratives. I just logged what was observable. And somewhere in that process, something else shifted too. My relationship with silence. Silence stopped being avoidance. It became a choice. Not because I was planning something, but because I understood that the most dangerous thing I could do now was speak without leverage. This wasn't about catching anyone. It was about protecting myself from a story I hadn't written, but might soon be written about me. That afternoon in this conference room didn't feel like a turning point at the time. It felt like a pause. Looking back, it was the moment I stopped being a background character in my own life. Once you stop assuming good faith will protect you, silence changes its meaning. Before, my quiet had been reactive, a way to keep things smooth, to avoid friction, to signal that I wasn't a problem. Now it has become deliberate, measured, boundaried. I spoke when accuracy required it. I stayed silent when speaking would only create noise. No one noticed the difference, which told me everything I needed to know about how they were listening in the first place. My boss, in particular, seemed relieved. I asked fewer clarifying questions in meetings. I no longer challenged vague language. I took notes. I nodded. I followed up in writing, calmly, neutrally. From the outside, it probably looked like compliance, like I had finally settled fully into the role they designed for me. Internally, I was tracking alignment. I paid attention to how decisions were framed versus how they were executed. I noted when responsibility was implied rather than assigned. I watched how my access continued to expand without explanation, and how certain requests arrived with urgency but no paper trail. When I asked for confirmation, I asked it kindly, professionally, without accusation. Just to confirm you'd like me to proceed with X as discussed? Those emails often went unanswered. But silence, too, is data. I began to understand that I was being trusted not because of my authority, but because of my predictability. They assumed I would not disrupt the flow, that I would absorb risk quietly. So I stopped absorbing it. I clarified the scope. I documented boundaries. I created a personal archive of facts, dates, times, access logs, version histories, nothing illegal, nothing invasive, only what I was already authorized to see. Still, I told no one, not friends, not colleagues, not even myself, fully. I didn't frame it as preparation. I framed it as professionalism. The truth was, I was buying time. Time to understand the system I was inside. Time to see whether what I was noticing would resolve on its own or escalate. The escalation came softly. One evening, my boss stopped by my desk as I was packing up. Casual, friendly. "Hey," he said, "just a heads up. We might need to move some things around soon. Nothing for you to worry about." That sentence, "nothing for you to worry about," landed differently than it used to. I smiled. "Okay." He lingered for a second, as if expecting a question. I didn't give him one. That was the moment I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. Brief, controlled, but real. People who expect resistance know how to prepare for it. People who expect silence rely on it. From then on, I noticed how often my silence created space. Not for calm, but for assumption. They filled the gaps with their own confidence, their own narratives. And I let them. Because every assumption they made reduced the number of variables I had to account for. I wasn't trying to trap anyone. I wasn't trying to outsmart anyone. I was simply letting the truth continue on its path without interruption. There's a misconception that power comes from action. Often, it comes from restraint, from knowing when not to correct someone as they walk further into their own version of events. I continued doing my job well. I met deadlines, I supported the team, I remained helpful. But I stopped volunteering contexts that weren't requested. I stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine to fill. And in that quiet, the shape of what was happening became clearer. Not all at once, but enough. Enough for me to understand that if this ever came to a head, my calm would be mistaken for compliance, and that misunderstanding would be their final error. At the time, though, it didn't feel like power. It felt like waiting, like standing still in moving water, letting the current show itself. And the current was moving faster than they realized. What they never noticed wasn't intelligence. It wasn't skill. It was attention. Attention doesn't announce itself. It doesn't interrupt meetings or ask for praise. It sits quietly and connects things over time. And because I had been underestimated for so long, my attention had room to move freely. While they were busy performing certainty, I was observing behavior. I noticed how systems were used differently depending on who thought they were being watched. How access logs told stories no one bothered to read because they assumed access meant responsibility. How after-hours productivity was praised without curiosity. I didn't change anything externally. I didn't restrict access or flag anomalies to compliance. That would have forced the story to move faster than I was ready for. Instead, I learned how our internal systems recorded actions. Not just that something happened, but how. What could be altered? What couldn't? What left a trail no one could erase without knowing exactly where to look? I learned which cameras were decorative, and which ones actually logged time-stamped footage tied to badge access. Which system synced automatically? Which required manual overrides? Most importantly, I learned the difference between capability and ownership. I had access, yes, but I wasn't the one who initiated certain processes. I wasn't the one who authorized exports. I wasn't the one who removed physical devices from secure areas. Those actions belonged to someone else, and that distinction mattered. I began mapping everything privately, not in a single document, but across time. Patterns of behavior, sequences, dependencies. I wasn't building a case. I was building understanding. Meanwhile, the office continued as usual. My boss grew more relaxed, more casual. He spoke openly around me, assuming I was still what I'd always been. Dependable background. Someone who wouldn't question the story forming around them. Once, during a late meeting, he joked about how overkill some security measures were. "People worry too much," he said. "We trust each other here." Trust, I'd learned, is often invoked when accountability is inconvenient. I smiled, said nothing. Another time I overheard him on the phone in his office, door half closed, not because I was listening, because he was loud. He mentioned timelines, pressure, needing things handled. I didn't assume what that meant, I just noted when it was said. Slowly, a picture emerged. Not of malice, but of desperation. Shortcuts taken under stress. Assumptions were made about who would carry the consequences. And I was still the easiest container. What they never noticed was that I had stopped being emotionally invested in being seen as good, or loyal, or agreeable. I was invested in being accurate. I began exporting my own records. Not company files, but logs I was authorized to access. Summaries of my own activity, confirmations of scope. I stored them securely, ethically, within policy. Everything I did was clean, auditable, boring. That's important because boring is credible. No dramatic downloads, no midnight activity, no sudden spikes, just consistency. And then there was the night that would later become central, though at the time, it barely registered. I had left the office early for once, a rare personal commitment. As I walked out, I passed my boss in the hallway. He looked surprised to see me leaving. "Half day?" he asked. Half joking. "Just today," I said. He nodded, watched me go. I didn't think about it again until much later, when timelines mattered and assumptions were questioned. Because what they never noticed was that my absence created contrast. They were so used to me being there, late, steady, predictable, that they stopped accounting for the possibility that I wasn't. That's the danger of turning a person into a constant. You forget they can move. In the weeks that followed, I continued quietly. No hints, no warnings. I let them believe the version of me they were comfortable with. Because correcting that perception would have cost me the one advantage I had left. And I understood something then that I wish more people talked about. Power doesn't always come from being louder or more visible. Sometimes it comes from letting others underestimate the amount of ground you're actually covering. By the time anything surfaced, by the time questions were asked, the answers already existed. They just weren't where anyone expected to look. The private reveal didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as confirmation. By then, I had stopped reacting emotionally to new information. Everything went through the same internal filter. Is this observable? Is it verifiable? Does it change the structure of what I already know? Most things didn't. But one afternoon, while reviewing a routine audit trail, something I'd done dozens of times before, I noticed a convergence, not a spike, not an anomaly, a convergence. 3 systems, different purposes, same timestamp window. Individually, each record was unremarkable. Together, they formed a sequence that was coherent. Access badge log, internal system activity, external device registration, all within minutes of each other. And none of it involved me. I sat back in my chair and let the information settle. No rush, no adrenaline, just wait. This was the first time I could see the shape of the truth without filling in any gaps myself. The systems had done that for me. Still, I didn't act. I didn't screenshot, I didn't export, I didn't email anyone. I opened my notebook and wrote one word: alignment. Because this wasn't about catching someone in a lie. It was about understanding how easily a lie could be aimed at me if things went wrong. I replayed the past few months in my head. Not emotionally, but structurally. The expanded access, the verbal requests, the lack of written confirmation. The way my name hovered close to responsibility without ever quite landing on authority. If something were discovered, if questions were asked, I could already imagine how the story would be told. Savannah handled those systems. Savannah had access. Savannah worked late. Savannah was reliable. And then quietly, Savannah must have done it. That was the moment the ground shifted beneath my feet. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood the risk clearly for the first time. I wasn't just invisible. I was convenient. That night, at home, I reviewed my own records. Not company data, my notes, my timelines, my summaries. I cross-checked dates, calendar entries, my physical presence. And there it was, a clean absence. On the night one of the key access events occurred, I wasn't there. Not late, not early, not quietly in the background. I was gone. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now it meant everything. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sober. Because evidence doesn't care how you feel. It only cares whether it exists. And now it did. I slept poorly that night. Not from anxiety, but from the weight of knowing I was standing at the edge of something irreversible. Once you see the full picture, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to assuming neutrality. The next day, I went to work as usual. I smiled. I answered questions. I completed tasks. And I said nothing. Because this was no longer about gathering information. It was about deciding when to stop the story from being written without me. I didn't know yet how it would surface. only that it would. People who take shortcuts eventually create pressure. Pressure creates mistakes. Mistakes create exposure. All I needed to do was remain where I was, clean, consistent, documented, until that exposure happened. I wasn't waiting for revenge. I wasn't waiting to confront anyone. I was waiting for the moment when silence was no longer interpreted as weakness, but as restraint. The reveal was private because it had to be. If I'd shared it then, it would have turned into a dispute, a battle of narratives. I didn't want a narrative. I wanted facts that could stand alone in a room where I didn't need to raise my voice. And for the first time since all of this began, I knew that room existed. I just hadn't entered it yet. Once you know the truth, you owe yourself a decision. Not immediately, not emotionally, but deliberately. I spent several days moving through my routine with a new awareness, like walking through a familiar building after learning where the structural weaknesses are. Nothing looks different, but everything feels conditional. I ran scenarios quietly, the way you do when you're trying to be honest with yourself. I could confront my boss privately, lay out what I'd noticed, give him a chance to explain. That path assumed good faith would resurface once challenged, but good faith doesn't usually survive desperation. And desperation had already entered the room. I could escalate internally, compliance, HR, legal. That would trigger procedures, yes, but it would also force me into a reactive position. I would become part of an investigation instead of a witness to facts. My motives would be questioned alongside the evidence. Or I could do nothing, let things play out, hope the risk passed me by. That option was tempting in the way avoidance often is. But it came with a cost I wasn't willing to pay. Living with the knowledge that silence this time would be surrender. The decision point wasn't about action versus inaction. It was about irreversibility. Once I chose a path, there would be no returning to the version of work where I believed effort alone was enough to keep me safe. I thought about my moral code, the one I'd rarely had to articulate before. Never accuse without proof. Never act without being able to live with the outcome. I had proof, not of intent, not of motive, but of course of presence, of absence. What I didn't have was immunity, so I chose the only option that protected both. I prepared without accusing. I ensured my own records were complete. Not embellished, not framed, just complete. I verified dates against neutral systems, badge logs, calendar entries, network timestamps. I separated what I knew from what I suspected. That distinction mattered more than anything. And then I waited, because there is a moment, often brief, when pressure causes people to overreach, to formalize a story too early, to make an accusation before checking whether it can survive scrutiny. That moment was coming. I could feel it in the tightening around deadlines, in the way my boss spoke more carefully around some people and more casually around others, in the sudden interest in process accountability. One afternoon, I was called into a meeting with no agenda. My boss sat across from me, hands folded, voice measured. He spoke about concerns, about irregularities, about the importance of transparency. I listened. He didn't accuse me. Not yet. He didn't have to. The implication hovered close enough to touch. And that's when I knew. The story was already forming. I just wasn't supposed to hear it yet. I nodded, asked clarifying questions, took notes. When the meeting ended, I returned to my desk and wrote down everything that had been said, word for word, as best I could remember. Not to weaponize it, to anchor it. Because once an accusation is made official, memory becomes unreliable. Language shifts. Intent gets rewritten. I wasn't going to argue memory against authority. I was going to let the record speak. That night, I made the final. Not to expose anyone, not to confront anyone, but to remove myself from the role of convenient container. If something was going to happen, it would happen in a way that did not require me to defend my character. Only my location, my access, my documented actions. I didn't feel brave. I felt clear. Clarity is quieter than courage. It doesn't need witnesses. And once the decision was made, the waiting ended. Not because things moved faster, but because I stopped wondering what I would do when the moment arrived. I already knew. Once the decision was made, nothing on the surface changed. That was the point. I still arrived on time, still answered messages, still completed my work with the same precision I always had. If anyone was watching me for signs of defensiveness or withdrawal, they would have been disappointed. What changed was invisible. I stopped doing favors that blurred responsibility. When someone asked me to just take care of it, I asked politely for scope in writing. When instructions came verbally, I summarized them in follow-up emails, framed as confirmation, not a challenge. Per our conversation, I'll proceed with X unless you advise otherwise. Often, no one advised otherwise. I didn't chase responses. I didn't remember. I simply let silence become part of the record. At the same time, I quietly reduced my exposure. I didn't revoke access. That wasn't my role. But I stopped using access that wasn't strictly necessary. I worked within narrower lanes, clearly defined, clearly logged. That way, if questions ever arose, the contrast would be unmistakable. I also began preparing for something I hoped wouldn't be necessary, but knew might be. I reviewed company policy, not obsessively, just enough to understand the process. Who handled what? When escalation became mandatory? When external authorities were involved? I noticed how easily internal ambiguity could spill outward, and I made sure my own actions never crossed that line. There's a misconception that silence means passivity. In reality, silence can be very busy. I gathered my own documentation into a single chronological archive. Not to present, not to threaten, just to exist. Emails, meeting notes, access logs, calendar entries. Each item alone was unremarkable. Together, they told a story that didn't rely on interpretation. I didn't label anything. I didn't annotate with emotion. I let dates and timestamps do the work. Meanwhile, pressure continued to build around me. My boss began referencing accountability more often. He spoke about protecting the company, about serious consequences if certain lines were crossed. He never looked directly at me when he said these things. I understood that tactic. It allows fear to spread without liability. It invites self-policing. I didn't react. I had already done the most important thing. I had made myself boring to investigate. No anomalies, no deviations, no sudden behavior changes, just consistency. And consistency, under scrutiny, becomes a shield. One evening, as I was packing up, a colleague asked casually, "Hey, you've been leaving earlier lately. Everything okay?" I smiled, just balancing things better. It was true, and it mattered. Because later, much later, that detail would anchor everything. I didn't know exactly when the accusation would come. I just knew it would. People under pressure often act before they have to. They formalize fear into paperwork. They turn suspicion into process. And when they do, they assume the person they've underestimated won't be ready. They assume silence means confusion. What they don't account for is preparation that doesn't announce itself. So I waited, not anxiously, not passively, just steadily. Because once a story becomes official, it stops being about persuasion. It becomes about evidence. And I was done speaking. The consequences didn't arrive with an announcement. They arrived as an absence. Small things, at first. A meeting I was usually invited to, canceled, then rescheduled without me. An email thread that stopped one reply short of including my name. A decision that used to require my input was suddenly finalized elsewhere. No one said anything, no one had to. When systems shift under pressure, they don't creak loudly. They redistribute weight. I could feel it happening around me. Not directed at me exactly, but away from me, as if the organization were unconsciously rearranging itself in anticipation of a problem it hadn't named yet. My boss grew distant, polite but tight. Conversations became shorter. Instructions are more formal. I stayed the same. That contrast seemed to unsettle him. One morning, I was asked to provide documentation for a routine internal review. Nothing unusual. I complied immediately. Clean records, clear timelines. Later that day, another request came, this one broader. Access logs, historical summaries, a scope that extended beyond my usual responsibilities. I provided only what was requested, nothing more, nothing less. Still, I noticed how the tone had changed. What had once felt like trust now felt like testing. And testing always has a purpose. Word began to spread quietly. Not accusations, just tension. People sensed something was wrong without knowing what. That's how organizations communicate distress. Through omission, not confrontation. A colleague stopped by my desk and asked, "Everything okay? Things feel weird." I nodded. I think there's just a lot going on, which was true, just not in the way they meant. The real shift happened on a Friday afternoon. I was called into a meeting with HR present. No agenda, no warning. My boss spoke carefully, too carefully. "There are concerns," he said, choosing each word as if it had weight. "About the handling of sensitive materials. I listened. He didn't accuse me directly. He didn't have to. The implication did the work for him. HR asked neutral questions, procedural questions, about access, about the process. I answered calmly, factually. I referenced dates, times, scope. I did not defend myself. I did not speculate. I did not volunteer theories. I watched something subtle happen in that room. Not relief, not victory, but imbalance. Because while they were searching for uncertainty, I was offering structure. After the meeting, I returned to my desk and worked until the end of the day. No one stopped me. No one said anything. But the air had changed. By Monday, I was placed on temporary administrative leave pending review. That was when the story became real. I went home that day and sat at my kitchen table, looking at the same records I'd already reviewed dozens of times. Nothing had changed. The facts were still the facts. What had changed was the frame. Someone had decided the risk was no longer hypothetical. And when organizations feel threatened, they look for containment. I was still the most convenient container. Then came the call. Not from HR, not from legal. From a police department. Calm, procedural, almost apologetic. They explained that a report had been filed, that my employer had raised concerns about intellectual property. And then the sentence landed, heavy, formal, unmistakable. My boss filed a police report claiming I stole company IP. I didn't interrupt, I didn't argue. I asked one question. May I have the report number? There was a pause on the line, a brief recalibration. Yes, the officer said, and gave it to me. When the call ended, I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I felt something quieter and more dangerous. Finality. Because once a narrative crosses into the legal system, it stops being interpersonal. It becomes structural. And structures don't care about intent. They care about evidence. What my boss didn't realize, what none of them realized yet, was that in moving the story forward, they had finally placed it in the one environment where I was no longer at a disadvantage. Because now silence wasn't avoidance. It was in alignment with the truth. Once the police report was filed, everything they might have done quietly became impossible. That's the part people don't understand until it's too late. There is a window where mistakes can still be corrected privately. Once you step outside that window, once you involve systems that don't care about internal politics, control evaporates. I could feel that loss of control rippling outward almost immediately. Emails that had gone unanswered for weeks suddenly arrived within minutes. Polite, concerned, over-explaining. People who hadn't checked in for months wanted to see how I was doing. I responded to none of it. Not because I was angry, but because anything I said outside the proper channels could now be misinterpreted. Or worse, misused. Instead, I waited for the formal process to unfold. The detective assigned to the case called 2 days later. He was direct, neutral, and uninvested in office hierarchies. He asked about my role, my access, and my hours. I answered each question calmly and offered documentation when it was relevant. He didn't react much. He just listened. That was when I realized the first crack had already appeared on their side. Because when people expect panic, composure reads as confidence, and confidence makes investigators slow down. Meanwhile, inside the company, things were unraveling. I heard about it indirectly, through colleagues who didn't know what they were telling me. Meetings canceled, legal pulled in. IT is scrambling to reconstruct timelines that should have been obvious from the start. That's what happens when certainty is replaced with verification. My boss tried to regain footing. He requested a clarifying conversation through HR. He wanted to explain, to add context. Context is what people reach for when facts stop cooperating. I declined, not rudely, not dramatically. I simply said I would communicate through my attorney if necessary. That word, attorney, changes temperature instantly. After that, the tone shifted from confidence to urgency. Mistakes surfaced, small ones, then larger. Someone realized certain approvals weren't logged. Someone else noticed that access didn't equal action. That responsibility had been assumed, not assigned. And then there was the question no one could answer cleanly. If Savannah did this, when? Because time matters. Presence matters. Alibis aren't dramatic in real life. They're mundane. Calendar entries, badge swipes, security footage. The company requested CCTV access for the relevant dates, expecting confirmation. What they got instead was contradiction. Because the cameras didn't show me. They showed my boss. The footage was clean, time-stamped, unambiguous. The CCTV showed him leaving with the driver at 7:42 p.m. That single detail collapsed weeks of assumption. It didn't prove motive, it didn't explain intent, but it destroyed plausibility. From that moment on, the question stopped being what happened and became why the wrong person was accused. And that's a much harder question to answer. Panic set in. Not loud, not cinematic, but procedural. Meetings behind closed doors, calls rerouted, language softened. Too late. Once evidence contradicts an accusation, every previous decision is re-examined. Every shortcut becomes visible. The company attempted damage control. Statements were revised. The narrative shifted from certainty to misunderstanding. But misunderstandings don't trigger police reports. By then, the story was no longer theirs to manage. And I understood something with absolute clarity. I didn't need to say anything else. They had already said too much. The confrontation didn't happen the way people imagine confrontations happen. There was no raised voice, no slammed door, no moment where someone finally snapped. By the time we were in the same room again, all the heat had already burned off, leaving only residue. It was arranged through attorneys, neutral ground, neutral language, a conference room that felt deliberately impersonal, glass table, water bottles untouched, everyone seated with space between them, as if distance itself were part of the protocol. My boss sat across from me. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked smaller, not defeated, just recalibrated, like someone who had misjudged the strength of a current and was still adjusting his footing. He didn't look at me at first. The attorney spoke, then another. Facts were stated in a tone that didn't invite debate. Timelines, access, footage. When the CCTV was mentioned, I watched his jaw tighten, not in anger, but in recognition. There are moments when denial stops being useful. This was one of them. He finally looked up at me then, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. Not as infrastructure, not as a buffer, not as someone who would smooth things over. As a witness. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said. His voice was even, careful, the kind of voice people use when they're trying to sound reasonable after the ground has shifted beneath them. I didn't respond immediately, not because I was searching for words, but because I didn't need many. "I didn't either," I said. That was it. No accusations, no explanation of how I'd felt, no inventory of past slights. Feelings were irrelevant here. Facts had already done the work. He started to say something else. About pressure, about timelines, about how things had gotten complicated. I raised a hand slightly, not aggressively, just enough. "This isn't a conversation I need to have," I said. Calm, flat, true. The record already exists. Silence followed, not awkward, just final. What struck me most in that moment was how little satisfaction I felt. There was no rush, no sense of victory, only alignment. For months, I had lived inside a version of myself that others had edited down, simplified, flattened, made convenient. Sitting there, I realized that version no longer had authority over me. The meeting ended without ceremony. No apology was offered, not formally, and I didn't ask for one. Apologies are for relationships. This was about responsibility. As I walked out, I felt lighter. Not because something had been won, but because something had ended. The need to explain myself, the need to be careful, the need to stay small. Those things dissolved quietly, without announcement. Outside, the day continued like any other. Cars passed, people talked on their phones. Life moved forward, indifferent to what had just concluded. And that was exactly how it should be. Because true confrontation isn't about spectacle. It's about standing still while the truth finishes arriving, and realizing you don't need to push it the rest of the way. When everything was over, when the investigation closed, when the report was retracted, when my name was no longer attached to suspicion, I expected to feel transformed. I didn't. What I felt was clarified. There's a difference. Transformation implies becoming someone else. Clarification is about seeing who you've been all along, without distortion. I returned to work briefly, just long enough to close the loop professionally. I didn't linger. I didn't try to reclaim space that had never truly been mine. Some environments teach you lessons, but aren't meant to keep you. People treated me differently then, carefully, respectfully, as if a new label had been applied. I noticed it, but I didn't internalize it, because I knew something they didn't. Their recognition wasn't what had changed my position. My boundaries had. I left that role not with bitterness, but with a clean sense of departure. No scorched earth, no speeches. Just a quiet exit that matched the way I had entered years earlier. What stayed with me wasn't fear, it was precision. I became more precise about what I accept, about what I document, about where I place my trust. I no longer confuse being helpful with being expendable. I no longer mistake silence for safety unless it's chosen. And perhaps most importantly, I stopped outsourcing my sense of legitimacy to systems that benefit from my invisibility. I still work quietly. That part of me didn't disappear. I still believe in calm over chaos, in preparation over performance. But now quiet comes with structure, with lines that are visible, to me at least. The world didn't suddenly become fair. Work didn't magically become safe. But I did become harder to misplace. There's a confidence that comes not from winning, but from knowing you can survive being misunderstood, if you're willing to protect the truth without advertising it. I carry that confidence differently now, not as armor, as alignment. The notebook I used to document everything still sits on my desk. I don't use it the same way anymore. Not because I'm careless, but because I'm intentional. I write fewer things, but I write them clearly. I don't watch people constantly. I don't assume threat, but I don't assume innocence either, not where power is involved. What I learned is simple, but not easy. You don't need to be loud to be unmovable. You don't need to be seen to be solid. You don't need to accuse to be believed. If the record can speak. I didn't walk away from that experience feeling superior. I walked away feeling finished with something I had outgrown. And that, I've learned, is a form of strength that doesn't announce itself. There's a version of this story that could end with triumph, with vindication, with a clear villain and a clear victory. This isn't that story, because what stayed with me wasn't the accusation or even the exoneration. It was the slow realization of how easily quiet people become convenient containers for other people's risk. No one set out to destroy me, that's important to say. What happened wasn't fueled by hatred or cruelty. It was fueled by pressure, by shortcuts, by a system that rewards certainty and punishes nuance, and by my own willingness, at the beginning, to be invisible. That's the part I had to own. I thought staying calm would keep me safe. I thought being reliable would protect me. I thought if I just did my work well enough, the truth would naturally rise. But truth doesn't rise on its own. It waits. It waits for records, for structure, for someone willing to hold still long enough for it to arrive without being reshaped. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about control over yourself, over your reactions, your documentation, your timing. It's about knowing when to speak and when not to interrupt the truth as it's forming. What I learned, painfully and clearly, is this: silence is only power when it's chosen. Invisibility is only safe when it's temporary. If you are quiet, observant, dependable, those qualities are not weaknesses, but they do require boundaries. Without them, your calm can be mistaken for consent. And once consent is assumed, it can be exploited. I don't tell this story to warn you against trusting people. I tell it to remind you to trust records more than reassurance. To understand that fairness is not automatic in systems built on speed and hierarchy. You don't have to be suspicious. You just have to be precise. Most of us will never face something as extreme as a police report. But many of us have felt the smaller versions of this. Being overlooked, being spoken over, being quietly positioned to absorb risk we didn't create. If that's you, I hope this story offers something steady, not fear, not anger, but clarity. You don't need to confront every slight. You don't need to prove yourself loudly. You just need to know where you stand and make sure the truth can find you there. Before I end, I want to ask you something, not rhetorically, but genuinely. Have you ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, only to realize later that the silence was costing you more than speaking ever would? If you're comfortable, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments.